Flight 814. Oceanic Airways Flight 814, from Los Angeles to Sydney, was a routine overnight flight. A wide-body aircraft, 347 passengers, an experienced crew. Until, over the central Pacific Ocean, it stopped responding. Didn't disappear from radar. No, it kept flying for another 4 hours, maintaining course, altitude, and speed. And unresponsive. And when military aircraft finally intercepted it and forced it to land at an alternate airfield, it wasn't the medics who boarded. The first were people in hazmat suits. Because the worst thing that can happen in flight isn't engine failure, it's the failure of humanity, or its transformation into something unimaginable. This story is pieced together from the transcripts of the flight recorders, the testimony of survivors, those who were interviewed, and the chilling recordings from personal devices. Flight 814 seemed exemplary. The pilot in command was Captain Mark Reed, a 20,000-hour veteran, meticulous and calm. The first officer was David Chen, ambitious and technically savvy. Senior flight attendant Karen Blair kept the crew under control with an iron fist and a smile. Among the passengers were a married couple with a hyperactive 3-year-old son, Louis, a group of students returning from vacation, an elderly couple celebrating a wedding anniversary, a businessman in first class, and, not least, Dr. Lisa Wade, an infectious disease specialist returning from a conference. 3 hours after takeoff, when the plane was already well above the ocean and the cabin lights were dimmed, the first sound was heard. It wasn't loud, not alarming. A dull, wet thud, as many assumed, came from the back of economy class, from the galley and the lavatory. Several passengers in the back rows turned around. Student Evan even stood up to watch. He saw flight attendant Emily, a young woman who had just emerged from the restroom, pale and shaking, trying to open a bottle of water. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded without looking and quickly went into the back room. 15 minutes later, a warning light began flashing in the cockpit. Not an emergency. It indicated a cabin pressurization system malfunction. The pressure was normal, but a sensor in the tail showed a microscopic leak. Captain Reed contacted the control tower. They advised a descent to 3,000 meters as a precaution and continued the flight. The nearest airfield was at least 4 hours away. Reed announced to the passengers a minor technical issue and a gentle descent. The fasten seatbelts sign lit up in the cabin. There was no panic, just a slight irritation from the interrupted sleep. And then the coincidences began. Passenger 34F, a middle-aged man, suddenly developed a nosebleed. He laughed sheepishly and said it was the dry air. The student sitting next to him in cabin 34, he began shivering uncontrollably. She asked for another blanket. An elderly woman in cabin 21, A, complained to her husband of a sharp, piercing headache right behind my eye. Her husband calmed her with a pill. Captain Reed, exercising caution, requested clearance from the controller to land in Hawaii, despite the fact that it would increase the flight's duration. At that moment, David, the first officer, pointed out a new set of signals. Several secondary sensors in the aft compartment had failed. Temperature sensors, the elevator position sensor. Looks like a localized power failure, David suggested. Or moisture, a short circuit. They sent experienced flight attendant Michael to check the electrical panel in the aft compartment. Michael didn't return for 5 minutes. He didn't answer the radio. Karen, the senior flight attendant, went to look for him. What she saw in the narrow service corridor near the rear lavatories made her blood run cold. Michael was lying on the floor, huddled, shaking with small, rapid tremors. Blood was streaming from his nose and ears. Emily sat next to him, leaning against the wall. She stared into space and muttered something, convulsively clenching and unclenching the hem of her uniform. A sweet, metallic smell, mixed with the smell of vomit, hung in the air. Karen, suppressing her panic, reported to the captain, "We have two emergencies in the aft section. Michael and Emily. Symptoms unclear. Nosebleed, shaking, confusion. Medical attention required." Agitation was already noticeable in the cabin. Whispers drifted through the rows. Dr. Lisa Wade, summoned by Karen, quickly examined the flight attendants. Her diagnosis was alarming in its vagueness. "This doesn't resemble a heart attack or stroke in the classic sense. Neurological symptoms reminds me of poisoning or exposure to a neurotoxin. But what is the source?" She asked what they had eaten and drunk. It turned out they had both been drinking water from a small cooler in the back of the plane. Lisa requested that this water be quarantined. At that moment, 3-year-old Louis, in row 15, began crying loudly, complaining of a burning nose. His mother began bleeding from the nose. Panic, like an electric shock, rippled through the cabin. "What's happening? Is this in the air?" someone shouted. Captain Reed made a difficult decision. He declared a serious emergency and required an emergency landing in Hawaii. He requested an urgent medical convoy on the ground. But communication with air traffic control had already begun to deteriorate. His voice became hoarse and intermittent. The last thing heard on the ground was, "We have several cases of illness among passengers and crew. We suspect contamination," unquote. And then the connection was lost completely. Attempts to restore it were futile. Dozens of more indicators began flashing in the cockpit. Some of the navigation equipment failed. But worst of all, the pressurization system slowly but inexorably began to fail. The pressure began to drop. The automatic controls tried to compensate, but to no avail. People in the cabin began to feel a fullness in their ears and shortness of breath. The oxygen masks did not drop, only the pilot's emergency system activated. Captain Reed, his face covered in cold sweat, manually initiated an emergency descent to a safe altitude. David tried to determine the cause of the problem. "This isn't just one failure, Mark," he shouted. "This is a cascading failure. It's like something is corroding the systems in the aft section." Chaos erupted in the cabin. Several passengers were already exhibiting symptoms: vomiting, dizziness, aggression. Student Evan, trying to help an elderly couple, noticed the man in cabin 21A begin convulsing. His wife, bleary-eyed, simply stared out the window and hummed. Dr. Lisa, using her available resources, attempted to help, but her resources were insufficient. She demanded that Karen completely isolate the rear of the cabin. "Whatever it is, it seems to be spreading or acting selectively, but the epicenter is there, in the aft section, and that popping sound had a source." A businessman in first class, Mr. Haig, a large, commanding man, stood up and declared he was taking matters into his own hands. He and 2 other burly men went to the back to sort things out. They ignored Lisa. They went behind the curtain Karen had lifted. And a minute later, a heart-wrenching scream erupted from within. One of the men ran back out and collapsed. His face was bruised, foaming at the mouth. "Here, he's not human!" He managed to scream before his body convulsed. Mr. Haig did not return. The plane was now flying at 10,000 feet. The pressure had stabilized, but the cabin was a living hell. About 20 people were clearly unstable. Some were convulsing. Others sat silently, like zombies, staring into space. And still others were displaying paranoid aggression. Doctor Lisa put forward a grim hypothesis based on the tail odor and the symptoms. Exposure to a highly toxic organic phosphorus compound, possibly a nerve agent. It could have entered the air conditioning system through some cargo in the hold. A leak, that popping sound. It could have been a ruptured ampule or container. But where did the poison come from on a civilian flight? And why does it act so selectively? Captain Reed, struggling to maintain control, The controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive. Ordered Karen and the remaining sane flight attendants to search the passenger list for chemists, doctors, and military personnel. Dr. Lisa was on the list, and a certain Professor Arthur Fields, a biochemist. He was found in business class. He was panicked, but confirmed that the symptoms were consistent with poisoning by a military-grade nerve agent like VX or sarin. But they're instantaneous, and here, there's a progression. Like it's a slow-release aerosol, or it's not a pure substance, but a compound that activates on contact with air. Meanwhile, sounds were coming from the rear of the plane. Not screams, dull thuds, methodical, like someone pounding a fist on skin, and a voice. Mr. Haig's voice, but distorted beyond recognition, hoarse, shouting incoherent accusations. You poisoned us. You knew. You're all going to die. People rushed forward in panic toward the cockpit. A stampede ensued. Karen and another flight attendant, trying to calm the crowd, were knocked off their feet. At that moment, the main lights went out. All that remained was the emergency lighting, painting everything blood red. The plane shook in an air pocket and tilted. David Chen ran from the cockpit to assess the situation. Seeing the chaos, he tried to shout, but at that moment, one of the sick passengers, the same student who was shivering, lashed out at him. His eyes were bloodshot. He grabbed David by the throat with incredible force. A fight ensued. Someone hit David over the head with a fire extinguisher. The co-pilot lost consciousness. Captain Reed was left alone against the falling plane, against a series of failures, and against the cries from the cockpit. Open up, land this thing anywhere. Captain Reed locked the cockpit door. His hands were shaking, but his mind worked with icy clarity. According to calculations, Hawaii was still an hour away. Fuel was running low. Systems continued to fail, and behind them, in the cabin, a civil war raged. Healthy, or by their own admission, healthy passengers, driven by self-preservation, tried to subdue the aggressive and sick, using seatbelts, airbags, and anything else they could find. Dr. Lisa, with a split lip, tried to coordinate the actions of the healthy group, realizing that this was no longer a medical situation, but a military one. And then Professor Fields made a discovery, studying the aircraft map on the screen in his seat. In the rear baggage compartment, in a special cargo hold, was the code Bio-Has-Conditioned, an air-conditioned compartment for biomaterials. The cargo was registered to a pharmaceutical startup. They could have been carrying experimental neurotoxins for research, he told Lisa. The emergency cooling system failed due to a general electrical failure. The container could have depressurized. Vapors entered the air intake system. But that didn't explain the selectivity. If it had just been gas, everyone would have died. The answer came with the most terrifying call of all. It came from the cell phone of one of the passengers who had somehow managed to pick up a satellite signal. It was Mr. Haig's wife. She was sobbing and relaying the terrible news she had just learned from the FBI. The pharmaceutical startup that had sent the cargo was a front. They were developing not a cure, but a selective biometric weapon. The toxin was tuned to a specific genetic profile based on common markers. Essentially, it was designed to affect 40% of the population, causing panic and erratic behavior. The rest were to remain relatively healthy, carrying and spreading panic. It was a weapon of mass destruction, and the container was booby-trapped in case of unauthorized opening. That explosion. When this was revealed, a dead silence fell over the cabin. People exchanged glances. Who was the chosen one? Who was the victim of the weapon? And who was simply a hostage? Suspicion grew into paranoia. What if you're infected? What if you infect us? One woman hissed at her snot-running neighbor. At that moment, the plane shook from another powerful tail slam. someone or something hit the baggage compartment door, and the door began to give way. Captain Reed, almost miraculously, managed to land the damaged plane on the farthest runway of the Hawaiian airfield. One of the landing gears failed during landing. The fuselage struck the concrete, throwing up sparks, but the plane landed. When the plane came to a stop, silence reigned. A knock on the cabin door interrupted her. It was Karen, battered but alive. "Mark, you can open up. It's over." But that was only the beginning. The first to board weren't rescuers, but people in BSL-4 biosafety suits. The plane was quarantined. Passengers were escorted out one by one, divided into groups: the obviously ill, the suspicious, and the clean. Many resisted, unwilling to leave their families. Lisa and Professor Fields were immediately taken in for questioning. Captain Reed, who had survived this hell alone, faced an endless series of checks and accusations of unprofessionalism. Of the 347 people on board, 89 died, some from the toxin, some in fights and crushes, some at the hands of those the toxin had transformed into puppets of rage. Mr. Haig was found in the back of the plane. He was dead. A broken container containing biological markers lay next to him, but it later emerged that he himself was the main investor in that very startup. He was flying to inspect the cargo. The accident was no accident. It was sabotage by a frightened scientist trying to destroy the samples. He had no knowledge of the mine. The survivors never met. They were separated by lawsuits, non-disclosure agreements, and trauma. Some, seemingly healthy, later began experiencing bouts of unmotivated aggression or, conversely, catatonic apathy. Dr. Lisa wrote a book that no one published. The government intervened. And Flight 814 became a case study, not in aviation textbooks, but in classified biosafety and crowd psychology manuals. The most horrific discovery was this: the toxin was merely a trigger. It did not cause the main destruction and death. It was the people themselves who caused it. Fear, suspicion, the instinct for self-preservation that escalated into cruelty. In conditions of absolute isolation and uncertainty, amid the ticking of systems and the pounding of doors, civilization evaporates faster than liquid oxygen. All that remains is pure, undiluted terror of what your fellow traveler is capable of, or yourself. Because when a plane crashes, it's not the strongest who survive, but the most ruthless. And a true disaster isn't a blow. It's that moment, hours before, when you first look someone in the eye with hatred and realize you have nothing in common anymore. Just a metal hull and 6 kilometers of empty space below.